4 talentless K-pop rip-off bands, BEA, the Cats Whiskers, Cozmez, and Akanyatsura, have been chosen to headline Phantom Live's events at the Shady Club Paradox. These 4 bands soon begin to compete for the chance to win 10 billion yen while resisting the impulse to get freaky with one another. In a science lab in a cyberpunk dystopian future, an obviously mad scientist approaches a tube and informs the metal inside that he called Yasha that they would be meeting soon. Meanwhile, at a concert, a poor excuse for a band, BAE, played their hearts out to a room of adoring fans and ended their performance with a cringe-worthy pose. Afterward, while resting in the band room, they received an invitation from Club Paradox inviting them to participate in Paradox Live. Getting the invitation surprised them because Club Paradox had disappeared 10 years ago, along with the legendary group 𝐒𝐒𝐿, so they concluded that it must be a prank. The next day, Alan was woken up by Anne, who informed him that the invitation wasn't a hoax and that Club Paradox had been resurrected. The members of BAE then converged to watch a news report about the return of Club Paradox, which had returned to its original state overnight. Just then, the 3 musketeers received an email from Club Paradox containing a video of the club's mascot, 𝐒𝐒𝐿, who explained the process for the competition, as well as revealing the grand prize of 10 billion yen. Elsewhere, a boy band, Akanyatsura, also received an invitation to Club Paradox. Their leader announced that they would win in such a memorable way that everyone would know their names. They would use the 10 billion yen to resurrect the 𝐒𝐔𝐁𝐒𝐑𝐈𝐍𝐿 group to full health. Likewise, the terribly named band, the Cat Whiskers, also vowed to win the prize money and use it to save their rundown bar. In the ghetto, Kanata and Nayuta also received the Club Paradox invitation. Like the others, they vowed to win the 10 billion yen so they could finally get good digs and drugs for Nayuta. 𝐒𝐿𝐍 further announced that the second prize would be a confrontation with the legendary 𝐒𝐒𝐿. This news shocked Alan, and the bands were then told to attend the opening show in a month to qualify for the stage battle. Alan began to fangirl over 𝐒𝐒𝐿, and with that, the members of BAE resolved to win the tournament. A few days later, while in school, BAE discovered that their professor, Simon's group of creeps, would also be participating in Paradox Live. Alan asked him about 𝐒𝐒𝐿, and he described them as the ultimate group. Hajun then told Simon that BAE intended to defeat 𝐒𝐒𝐿 and showcase BAE's value to the world. Simon, however, insisted that his group, the Cat Whiskers, would win, as they had their eyes set on the bounty. Hajun dismissed his statement as the words of a madman and walked away, while his bandmates apologized to the professor on his behalf. Later that day, Alan, who looked as high as a kite, presented the band's new song to the others in a hyperactive manner. The next day, all the bands converged at Club Paradox, and a rando freaked out when he spotted Nayuta at the venue. Meanwhile, while Paradox Live was starting, the members of BAE were still sleeping and recovering after their late-night orgy. At the club, 𝐒𝐿𝐍 introduced the 4 participating bands, the Cat Whiskers, Akanyatsura, Cozmez, and BAE. But the members of BAE were nowhere to be found, so 𝐒𝐿𝐍 announced that if they failed to show up when the hour hand hit the top, then they would be disqualified. Just then, the members of BAE jumped down from a helicopter in style and began their electrifying performance. While paying Kanata for doing a job for them, the Akanyatsura boss and his lackey asked if he was prepared for the first stage of the battle, which was between Cozmez and BAE. Kanata showed no enthusiasm, while Akanyatsura rambled off praises about BAE's skill and high financial status. This caused Kanata to ask if they were implying that poor people like them couldn't win against an opponent like BAE. However, the Akanyatsura boss told him to be on guard, while Kanata remarked to himself that the members of BAE were too stupid to be an actual threat. Elsewhere, Kanata walked through the streets in a rage about having to face off with pampered kids who didn't understand hip-hop when he overheard some airheads talking about BAE performing later that night at Razzle Dazzle. While staring at his phone as he walked home, Kanata stumbled into 2 lowlifes, who then beat him into a pulp. When he finally got home, Nayuta cleaned up his injuries, and then they ate. At night, Kanata kept muttering about why he loved hip-hop and telling the story of their wretched lives. He told Nayuta that hip-hop was for songs for rebellion. It gives people the voice to assert their presence, and they would definitely win the next battle. The duo fist-bumped, while saying no one could beat them. Later that night, Kanata headed out to the club Razzle Dazzle, where Anne and Hanjun were already leaving. But Alan stayed behind to write some more mid-tempo lyrics. Afterward, Alan struggled to get home as he suffered from a trap reaction caused by using phantom metal. However, just as he was about to collapse, Kanata appeared and caught him, but then Alan said something foolish, which made Hanaka throw him on the floor in disgust and then take his metal. The next day, Alan explained to Anne and 𝐒𝐿 that his metal had been stolen. 𝐒𝐿 used Daddy's money to access the images captured by Razel's anti-theft surveillance camera. Using the images, they were able to identify the thief as Kanata. Back in their home, Kanata and Nayuta discussed what they would do with Alan's metal. They couldn't sell it because others couldn't use a metal that had memorized the DNA of its user, and no one would buy it. Nayuta called him out for being a loser who was scared that they would lose to BAE. He urged Kanata to believe in himself and stop being a whiny bitch, but Kanata couldn't. Meanwhile, Alan and Anne arrived at the ghetto to get Alan's metal back when they suddenly bumped into Kanata on the road. Alan pleaded with Kanata to give him back his metal, but Kanata refused and called him a spoiled rich kid looking for attention through hip-hop when they needed it to escape the ghetto. Alan accepted that he was privileged, but then got cringy. He insisted that hip-hop was a form of freedom of music, which didn't discriminate, so he did Phantom to prove himself. He added that it wasn't just for fun, and they were doing it to protect what they cherished. Just then, Nayuta walked up to them and told Kanata to return the metal, adding that he was pissed because Kanata had lost his confidence, but there was nothing to be afraid of. With that, Kanata returned the metal, and he made up with Alan. As they walked home, Kayuta teased Kanata about liking Alan, and they vowed to win. The next day, the duo performed at the first stage of the battle. After the completion of the first stage battle, Paradevi announced that the winners were the talentless hacks, BAE. Backstage, 𝐒𝐔𝐁𝐒𝐂𝐑𝐈𝐿, the rando who freaked out after seeing Kayuta the first night at Club Paradox, stared at Kayuta's picture on the screen like a scorned lover. Then the second round began with a performance by the Cat Whisperers, and he walked out alongside the other band members. Later that night, 𝐒𝐿 grumbled over their loss to Akanyatsura, but Simon remarked that they should accept it with grace. 𝐒𝐿 then asked if he noticed 𝐒𝐔𝐁𝐒𝐂𝐑𝐈𝐿, and Simon remarked that he hadn't looked good earlier and had been that way since the opening show. He added that 𝐒𝐂𝐁𝐒𝐑𝐈𝐿 looked afraid, while 𝐒𝐿 said that he always had bad train reactions and told Simon to head home and help Ryu deal with 𝐒𝐂𝐁𝐒𝐂𝐑𝐈𝐿. With that, Salman chuckled and left. Back at their home, 𝐒𝐂𝐁𝐒𝐂𝐑𝐈𝐿 kept whimpering and asked himself why Kayuta was at Club Paradox. Just then, Ryu arrived to console him, but 𝐒𝐂𝐁𝐒𝐑𝐈𝐿 kept rambling like someone was losing his mind. However, Ryu couldn't relate to his struggles because he didn't have trap reactions like the others. Later, 𝐒𝐂𝐁𝐒𝐂𝐑𝐈𝐿 started screaming as his trap reactions started while 𝐒𝐿 went in to help him. The next day, Ryu brought home a stray cat, which they all fawned over. Just then, Akanyatsura entered their bar looking like snacks, and while the kids went out to place some posters, the adults went aside to talk. They spoke about Ultra Trigger, a company that wanted to buy the bar for 10 billion won, the same price as the prize money. Akanyatsura's boss hinted that Ultra Trigger might be the one pulling the strings behind Paradox Live, and said he could feel something big going on. Their conversation ended as the kids returned from placing posters. Ryu suddenly started acting weirder than usual and confronted Akanyatsura's boss about not revealing his secret about his family members. After that, the crew left. Later, at the Ultra Trigger base, a mysterious scientist and his team observed readings of the band's performance. Back at the bar, Ryu's stray cat had fallen ill, and being dumb as a rock, he decided to take him to the vet under the heavy rain. However, he stumbled, which allowed 𝐒𝐂𝐁𝐒𝐂𝐑𝐈𝐿 to finally catch up to him, and they were soon joined by Simon and 𝐒𝐿, who brought along umbrellas. They located a vet, and the cat was treated while Simon and 𝐒𝐿 counseled 𝐒𝐂𝐁𝐒𝐑𝐈𝐿 about relying on them more. 𝐒𝐿 announced that his justice was to protect the bar and the Cat Whiskers music, and with that, they all raised their glasses to celebrate. 𝐒𝐿 thought about how from the moment he could understand his surroundings, it was expected that he would inherit the Yon conglomerate in the future. However, one day, things changed. At that point, Alan snapped him back to the present, where they were waiting to watch the Cat Whiskers perform. Although Alan and Anne were comfortable being losers, 𝐒𝐿 saw the competition as a war that he intended to win and the other competitors as his enemies. The Cat Whiskers performance started while 𝐒𝐿 soliloquized that he'd do anything to defeat their enemies. The Cat Whiskers celebrated their performance backstage with the members of BAE, whom Simon invited. While Alan and Anne gushed over their performance, 𝐒𝐿 described them as washed-up has-beens whose music had passed its expiration. Although 𝐒𝐿 was angered by his statements, Simon stated that they would not be changing their style. Ryu started sniffing the members of BAE like a horny cat and commented that Alan and Anne smelled the same, while 𝐒𝐿 smelled differently because he was placing himself outside the group. He added that 𝐒𝐿 was in a transparent box and only wanted people to see his good box, and he started laughing while adding that he'd start rotting if he didn't let himself out. Then Ryu whispered some words into 𝐒𝐿's ears, which caused him to lose all color in his face and push Ryu to the floor. 𝐒𝐿 then started to lose his 𝐒𝐿*T and ran out of the room while his bandmates ran after him. Later that night, Simon and Yohei talked about what Ryu said and contemplated becoming more greedy in their ambitions. Meanwhile, at the BAE house, Alan and Anne talked about how little they knew about Hanju. They realized that they knew very little about him, and that bothered Alan, so they called him out for coffee. Things got melodramatic as Alan confessed his feelings to Hanju and told him that he was also in a transparent box because he was scared of losing what they had if he showed them who he really was. Then he told them about his trap reactions. Alan said his parents loved classical music and hated that he listened to hip-hop, so they burned all his equipment and records. They definitely did not win any Parent of the Year awards. However, that event was the trauma that he kept seeing during his trap reactions. Next, Anne revealed her trap reaction, which involved her mother cutting her hair so she'd look like a boy. Her deranged mother would then call her Anjin, her little prince. Anne added that she still felt somewhere deep down that she was her mother's little prince. She concluded that she'd never be free of her mother, but she had accepted it. After hearing them spill their dirtiest secrets, Hanju revealed that Ryu had told him that he was expendable, which is why he had lost his 𝐶*T. He revealed that his trap reaction stems from the fact that he isn't useful. Everyone sees him as the son of the Yon conglomerate, but he was adopted when they needed an heir. They eventually gave birth to a son and sent him to Japan. After giving birth to an heir, they tossed him aside like used toilet paper and traumatized him for life. Hanjun revealed that he was scared that no one would ever need him, so he kept his distance from everyone before he got abandoned by those he loved. Things quickly devolved into a soap opera, as Alan confessed his undying love for Hanju and promised never to turn his back on him or abandon him. Then he spoke about the day Hanju found him crying on the streets and took him home like a stray. He added that Hanju saw potential in his music and gave him a cup of coffee. This declaration of love got Alan crying, and Hanju opened up his door. Anne thanked him for opening up to them, and together they went to make a new pot of coffee. On a dark, stormy night, the Akanyatsura boys found their master murdered in his office. This led to Akanyatsura vowing to avenge him and restore the reputation of the 𝐒𝐔𝐁𝐒𝐑𝐈𝐍𝐿 group, along with the others who had all become family. In the present, Aniki and Satsuki play around the house while making a stew, which results in Satsuki's phone getting ruined. As they return from getting a new phone, Paradevi announced on TV that the Cat Whiskers had beaten BAE in the third round of Paradox live stage battles. Just then, Satsuki, Ryo, and Hokusai noticed Kanata getting beaten up by some thugs in a dark alleyway and decided to help out. Hokusai intimated them into running away and then offered to help Kanata with whatever was bothering him. Kanata revealed that Nayuta was missing, and so Akanyatsura offered to help. Ryo was reluctant to participate, but Satsuki insisted that they help. While searching, Ryo complained that they were wasting their time searching for someone who was probably playing at the arcade. He insisted that Kanata was overreacting, but Hokusai told him that one mustn't take the family for granted, and he would also search for him in a frenzy if he were missing. Meanwhile, Kanata couldn't understand why the Akanyatsura boys were helping him when they weren't friends, so Satsuki explained that it was because Nayuta was his family, and they took family seriously. He also commended how in sync the two brothers were during gate performances and admitted being scared to face them in the next round. Kanata then revealed that he and Nayuta had fought over music the night before because Nayuta had insisted he explore the outside world more without him. Upon hearing this statement, Satsuki assured him that it was normal for brothers to fight. Later that evening, all four boys reconvened without finding Nayuta and deliberated on possible locations where he might be. But Kanata started acting like an immature toddler and told them he no longer needed their help. Satsuki started yelling about the importance of family, and they told Kanata about the attack on their group, which resulted in the deaths of most of their brothers and bosses. Then, they each give Kanata a sappy speech on the value of family. After hearing what they said, Kanata pleaded with them to help him find Nayuta. Just then, Kayuta walked to them and dissed the stench the Akanyatsura boys were giving off while asking what Kanata was up to. He then explained that he woke up early to go on a walk and then fell asleep somewhere. Satsuki got so pissed that he wanted to punch Nayuta but held back after seeing Kanata hugging him. Soon after, they all went for a meal, after which they returned to being rivals who'd confront each other on the stage. The next day, Akanyatsura Underground, who looked like Ken dolls, performed their Bad Boys track at Club Paradox, which was about feeding a kitty. Alan, Simon, and Yohei ogled at 𝐒𝐔𝐁𝐒𝐑𝐈𝐍𝐿's first album from their indie days, but they were too broke to afford it. Later on, Hanju spotted Alan standing by the store's window, looking at the album and smiling. The next day, Alan searched for jobs that would allow him to save enough to afford the album. Just then, Anne came over to ask what he was doing, but he refused to tell her, so she rubbed her melons against his back until he caved. 𝐒𝐒𝐁 interrupted their little canoodling session and reprimanded them for not having shame. He reminded them that they lost the last battle and asked them to work harder before leaving for a mystery location. Meanwhile, the Akanyatsura boys looked like thieves as they sneaked around school as part of a job for 𝐒𝐒𝐂𝐑𝐈𝐍𝐿 so they could raise money to buy 𝐒𝐒𝐂𝐑𝐈𝐏𝐍𝐿 first album. The job involved digging up dirt on Ryu, and so they kidnapped 𝐒𝐒𝐂𝐑𝐈𝐏𝐍𝐿 to get information from him. However, 𝐒𝐒𝐂𝐑𝐈𝐏𝐍𝐿 was too dense and timid to possess any information for them, aside from the fact that Ryu doesn't have trap reactions. This news stunned them all, and just then, Ryu entered the restaurant. Meanwhile, at the Akanyatsura office, 𝐒𝐒𝐂𝐑𝐈𝐏𝐍𝐿 paid Kanata to finish another job for him. Kanata then asked them to tell him everything they knew about the dangers of using phantom metal. 𝐒𝐒𝐂𝐑𝐈𝐏𝐍𝐿 revealed that metal erosion can begin without warning, has limits to a great extent, and is impossible to stop. Kanata then asked why he hadn't told his family about it, but before he could go further, 𝐒𝐒𝐂𝐑𝐈𝐏𝐍𝐿 called him out on his hypocrisy and stated that he had something important to protect. Hearing this, Kanata kept silent and walked away with 𝐒𝐒𝐂𝐑𝐈𝐏𝐍𝐿, wishing him luck in their battle against the cat Whiskers. After that, he met up with Kayuta, who was staring at 𝐒𝐒𝐂𝐑𝐈𝐏𝐍𝐿's first album, Starstruck. Elsewhere, the Akanyatsura boys, 𝐒𝐒𝐂𝐑𝐈𝐏𝐍𝐿 and Ryu, headed to the mall, where they found Alan working as a bag boy. After buying a weird sex toy for Ryu, the Akanyatsura boys demanded that he tell them what they wanted, but he gave them vague answers before running away with 𝐒𝐒𝐑𝐈𝐏𝐍𝐿. Afterward, he took them to get a super spicy curry that looked like it could boil their insides. They once again spotted Alan working as a waiter. 𝐒𝐒𝐑𝐈𝐏𝐿 gobbled down the spicy food, while the rest sang their hearts out in support. Once done, they asked Ryu what he did before joining the cat Whiskers, and he said something stupidly vague about white walls at a large mansion where he played with others. Elsewhere, Hanju spoke to a doctor who informed him that he had a high affinity for metal. The boys all followed Ryu to a shady neighborhood, where he pointed at a rundown building. Upon seeing the building, 𝐒𝐒𝐑𝐈𝐏𝐍𝐿 started having a panic attack and had to be moved somewhere else. When he felt better, he explained that he was a wimp, but 𝐒𝐒𝐑𝐈𝐏𝐿 comforted him. Then they all broke out in rap and were spitting mid-lyrics. However, 𝐒𝐒𝐑𝐈𝐏𝐿 loved the nonsense and felt better. Meanwhile, Alan continued hustling for money to buy the album until he was discovered by Hanju, who kicked him. Hanju then brought out the 𝐒𝐒𝐂𝐑𝐈𝐏𝐍𝐿 album, which he had purchased, and asked Alan to plead for it. Elsewhere, Ryu and 𝐒𝐒𝐑𝐈𝐏𝐿 walked home together, with Ryu still maintaining a poor Joker act. As they spoke, 𝐒𝐒𝐑𝐈𝐏𝐿 revealed that the ghost in the building Ryu showed them was his best friend, whom he killed. Ryu laughed at 𝐒𝐒𝐑𝐈𝐏𝐿's statement, and when 𝐒𝐒𝐑𝐈𝐏𝐿 insisted, his face turned truly into the Joker's, as he said the ghost was still on the building's rooftop. Then Ryu's personality suddenly switched back to normal. 𝐒𝐒𝐑𝐈𝐏𝐿 thought to himself that the kid couldn't possibly be alive because he had seen Naiwa, and then he trailed off. Paradevi revealed new matchups for the 5th and 6th stages of the battle. At their home base, Hanju commented that having Akanyatsura as their last opponent was a terrible matchup for them. His reasons were that they were a rowdy band that riled the crowd up. However, he didn't intend to lose, and the rest agreed with him. Elsewhere, Kanata searched for 𝐒𝐿 and found him bloody on the streets. 𝐒𝐿 suddenly turned into mud, causing Kanata to scream and wake up from his nightmare. Just then, 𝐒𝐿 walked into the room and asked him for details about the dream, but he refused. With that, 𝐒𝐿 started to leave the house, and Kanata pleaded that he come back to him like a clingy lover. At the Cat Whispers bar, Ryu continued to play his childish games until Toei did what he said. Meanwhile, 𝐒𝐒𝐑𝐈𝐏𝐿, the weirdo, continued staring out into space. He then asked Simon for permission to step out and play. Ryu asked to tag along, but he immediately refused and insisted on going alone. Once outside, he decided to visit the rundown building, and while there, he recalled lifting a sofa with 𝐒𝐿 once before. He then ran into an empty room, hoping to see 𝐒𝐿, but then remembered that he had killed him. While there, he got flashes of 𝐒𝐿's death and thought back to how difficult it was for him to fit in and make friends until he met 𝐒𝐿. He was getting bullied by some local thugs, and as they left, 𝐒𝐿 appeared, picked their pocket, and called him a weakling. From that day on, they became friends. However, 𝐒𝐒𝐑𝐈𝐏𝐿 continued to say that he never felt troubled by 𝐒𝐿. Soon enough, they placed a chair on a building rooftop, which was 𝐒𝐿's favorite place, and one day while sitting there talking, 𝐒𝐒𝐑𝐈𝐏𝐿 noticed that 𝐒𝐿 was getting weaker daily, which was a result of some experiments he was participating in for money. So when they met that night at the rooftop, Kayuta told him that he wanted to see him one last time because he couldn't go on anymore. He informed 𝐒𝐒𝐑𝐈𝐏𝐿 that he had developed phantom corrosion, and it was spreading, which meant he'd soon be nothing but a shell, and he couldn't let Kanata see him that way because it would break him. Then he told 𝐒𝐒𝐑𝐈𝐏𝐿 it was nice to meet him, looked up at the sky, and jumped to his death. 𝐒𝐒𝐑𝐈𝐏𝐿 was too slow and chicken to stop him or call for help, so he ran away. Just then, he spotted Nayuta walking past the building and ran out to meet him. However, Nayuta didn't remember him or what happened. This caused Shiki's slow brain to realize that Nayuta had lost his memory. Meanwhile, as it started to rain, the other members of the Cat Whiskers started searching for Shiki. Shiki stood under the rain, missing Kayuta and thinking about the times they shared together. Hajun kept having nightmares about his deadbeat parents, who abandoned him. Meanwhile, Alan and Anne were also recovering from their own trap reactions together, and remarked that Hajun was always more put together than them. Just then, Hanju walked out of his room looking like the perfect Ken doll, and Alan told him that he was better than them. Hanju agreed and said that he was perfect all the time. Later, BIE met with Simon to get information on Akanyatsura's strengths, so that they could plan for the next stage of the battle. Simon joked that they wanted to learn from his band's loss, but still went on to say that Akanyatsura's strength was their familial bond. Ever the egotist, Hanju argued that they wouldn't waver in their quest to prove that they are the best. His statement surprised Simon, who could see growth in Hanju. Nevertheless, he told them that he was looking forward to the next battle and left. Afterward, BIE contemplated Simon's words, and Hanju argued that a bond couldn't be all the Akanyatsura have. He added that the three members of BAEC knew how worthless familiar bonds could be. Then he left to purchase drugs from a questionable doctor to treat his rapidly spreading metal rot. As he walked out of the doctor's office, Hanju was met by the sexy-looking 𝐒𝐔𝐿𝐷, who warned him against patronizing the back alley doctor. 𝐒𝐔𝐿𝐷 informed him that the doctor was known for prescribing more than a person needed, but Hanju dismissed him. However, Hanju hesitated when 𝐒𝐔𝐿𝐷 asked why he was contesting, but soon went back to being a cocky bastard and said that he only plays for his benefit. Later that night, Pradevi announced that Cozmez had won the 5th round, and because they had 2 wins, they would be entering into an extra battle. Then he announced that BAE would be going first in their battle against Akanyatsura. Just then, BAE took the stage and started singing their worst song yet when Hanju suddenly collapsed. Alan and Anne took him backstage, where the Akanyatsura boys inquired about his health and if he was anemic. As they spoke, Anne noticed the metal corrosion on Hanju's arm, which shocked everyone. 𝐒𝐿𝐷 explained how dangerous the effects of metal corrosion were to everyone gathered there, and then he pulled up Hanju's shirt to showcase how bad they were. When asked what could be the solution, 𝐒𝐿𝐷 retorted that there was nothing they could do to help Hanju. He turned to apologize to his brothers for not informing them about the metal erosion earlier. Later on, the Akanyatsura's boys told 𝐒𝐿𝐷 that they knew the metal was something that could kill them, but they were willing to put their lives on the line. Back on stage, Paradevi was getting overwhelmed by boos from the crowd, but before they could roast him, Akanyatsura appeared on stage, ready to perform. A short while back, 𝐒𝐿𝐷 told Alan and Anne that the only way to save Hanju was to force their way into his mind using the metal. However, he wasn't entirely sure it would work, but he heard Buraikan had done it once to save their member Shura. With that, 𝐒𝐿𝐷 told them how to get into Hajun's mind and warned them that they might not make it back, but they were too stubborn to listen. As Akanyatsura performed their song, Anne and Alan dug into Hajun's memory of his parents dumping him. Hajun was slowly losing himself to the metal when Anne and Alan used the power of friendship to save him and got him to understand that he couldn't let his trauma rule his life. With that, Hajun remembered all the good times they shared and got better while thanking them for making him feel wanted. Once they were back in the real world, BAE was finally ready to give their Grammy-winning performance. BAE won the 6th stage battle against Akanyatsura, and as a result, they were to face off against Cozmez in an extra battle. The winning team would get 10 billion yen and the chance to face off against Buraikan. Upon hearing the news of their victory, Alan told Hajun and Anne that it was time for a training camp so they could improve on their wacky melodies and beat Cozmez. Hajun resisted the idea of a training camp, but when he saw Alan's puppy dog's eyes, he folded. However, thanks to Alan's stupidity, they ended up at a rundown cabin where they met the Akanyatsura boys. Alan informed them that they were there for a training camp. As they all caught up, the old witch who owns the hotel asked if they had all come to catch the rainbow neon stag beetle, a rare beetle which has been worshipped since ancient times as a messenger of the gods. The ugly old lady told them that anyone who captured the stag beetle would be blessed with the greatest of fortunes, be it money, love, or common sense. Alan and Satuski bought the old lady's scam and began searching for the beetle. Kayuta and Kanata, who were also in the hotel because plot armor overtook the discussion, laughed at Alan and Satuski's stupidity. Meanwhile, somewhere nearby, the cat Whiskers car also magically broke down close to the inn. Alan went off to find the magic beetle while Ha-Jun and Anne spoke about how important Ha-Jun was to BAE. In the forest, the boys, Hokusai, Satsuki, Ryu and Shiki were out looking for the beetle. While searching, Ryu asked Shiki if he had ever seen that ghost, and he replied that he had, but the ghost didn't remember him. Hearing this news, Ryu comforted his heartbroken friend. Elsewhere, Alan captured a stag beetle, but it was stolen by Kayuta and Kanata, who wanted to sell it online. They then got into an argument, resulting in the beetle's escape, and while chasing after it, Alan tripped on Kanata, and they got horny. Later in the night, the boys gathered in the warm spring for a bath, and the Akanyatsura boys urged Alan to win the extra battle for their sakes. Things soon turned into a party around the hotel, as everyone engaged in one fun activity or another, while Kanata served as the ball boy outside. However, he was soon joined by Alan, who told him that he was happy to face him again. Alan said that he, Ha-Jun and Anne would do whatever it took to protect the things that were important to them. After hearing what was important to him, Kanata replied that he was also glad to be facing BAE, and this time, they would wipe the floor with their tears. Just then, Kayuta came to see them holding hands and asked what was going on, and they both screamed nothing while blushing like a virgin. A short while later, Alan was about to begin writing new songs when a stag beetle landed on his shoulder, and a mysterious MI5 agent appeared behind him and informed him that his father had summoned him. Elsewhere, Seimon and Suiseki once again discussed the likelihood that Alpha Trigger was pulling the strings behind Paradox Live, especially because the groups called out all had some kind of connection to Alpha Trigger. In the Alpha Trigger headquarters, the Doctor met with a mysterious figure. As he headed to meet with his dad, who was the leading pianist in Japan, Alan thought back to his upbringing as a spoiled child, with his life planned out for him. His parents saw him as their masterpiece, but he never felt joy in what they wanted for him. Even though he was considered a gifted young man, he didn't connect with that type of music, and it wasn't until he listened to hip-hop that he enjoyed music. Then he realized that hip-hop was the music for him, but his parents hated it and declared hip-hop unacceptable. Being a melodramatic Nepo baby, Alan ran away from home. Just then his father arrived and asked how he was doing, but Alan asked why he had brought him there. His father stated that he would never acknowledge him, even if he won the Paradox. Then the old man instructed Alan to stop performing Phantom Lives because that would ruin his music. He also told him to return home. However, Alan refused because he wanted to win Paradox Live with his friends. Upon hearing Alan's childish reply, his father coldly informed him that his friends would all die of phantom metal corruption. Meanwhile, in the present, BAE was performing at Razzle Dazzle, but Alan kept thinking about his talk with his father. His father then called him shameless for putting his friends' lives at risk, so he'd be number one with him that takes life away. Back on stage, Alan tried creating an illusion, but his daddy words rang in his head, and the illusion failed. Later on, Hanju asked him what was going on, but Alan lied through his teeth and ran to the bathroom. Elsewhere, a mysterious silver-haired man said to himself that everything was in place, while the still mysterious scientist said to himself that they were almost done. At the battle, Akanyatsura performed to get the crowd excited for the battle. Meanwhile, at the science lab, the scientist declared that the time had come to change the world. Nayuta and Kanata prepared for their upcoming performance, and Nayuta thanked Kanata for broadening his horizons and thus making their music better. Anne also commended Hanju for his self-growth, but before he could respond, they were informed that they would be going on stage soon. Just then, Alan called Hanju and told him that he wouldn't be performing with them because he was a wimp. He informed them that he couldn't produce illusions, which shocked both of them. They tried reassuring him, but Alan kept having a meltdown and said his music was worthless. Hanju and Anne offered to find him, but Alan ended the call. On stage, Paradevi introduced Cozmez and then announced that BAE was missing. The other bands couldn't believe BAE would just forfeit the battle, while Paradevi gave them 30 seconds to arrive on stage. Meanwhile, Ryu looked stranger than usual and commented that the metal was being disturbed. BAE's 30 seconds were up, and Paradevi announced that Cozmez was the Paradox Live winner. However, the crowd started booing while Kanata ranted about not wanting an easy win. Just then the stage went dark, and the scientist walked up while telling all of them to shut up. The next Recap-Kun members, Shura and Yasha, took the stage. Meanwhile, the silver-haired man was also in the building heading to an unknown location. The sexy silver-haired stranger broke into the Alter Trigger Corporation and was expertly digging through their files like James Bond. He soliloquized that the Alter Trigger Corporation hid the truth about the dangers of phantom metal, which was the real reason behind Recap-Kun's final performance and the disappearance of the Club Paradox 10 years prior. Meanwhile, back at the stage, 𝐒𝐓𝐿 remarked that Cozmez was lucky that their opponent ran away with their tails between their legs, but the hot-headed 𝐾𝐈𝐍𝐊 yelled that something was wrong. Still, 𝐒𝐒𝐿 was unconcerned and asked if he needed the money or not. 𝐾𝐈𝐍𝐿 said he did, and then 𝐒𝐒𝐿 started their first performance in 10 years. Their performance had the fans going into a frenzy. Meanwhile, 𝐴𝐿 and 𝐿 finally found Alan at Club Razzle Dazzle. The other bands were starstruck by 𝐒𝐒𝐿 and wondered how they were still as good as they had been 10 years ago, but Ryu stated that it was because they were ghosts. 𝐒𝐒𝐿 finished their performance and told 𝐾𝐈𝐍𝐿 it was his turn, or he could if he wanted to. This got 𝐾𝐈𝐍𝐿 even riled up as if he had a stick up his bum, and he yelled that he and 𝐾𝐈𝐍𝐿 would take their throne. However, in a surprising turn of events, 𝐒𝐒𝐿 asked who 𝐾𝐈𝐍𝐿 was. After all, hadn't he always been on his own? And there was no 𝐾𝐈𝐍𝐿. They revealed that the thing standing and looking like 𝐾𝐈𝐍𝐿 was just an illusion. Back at Razzle Dazzle, 𝐴𝐿 and 𝐿 tried comforting Alan about his meltdown. However, Alan insisted that he was useless because he couldn't create illusions and could no longer hear sounds in his heart. He explained what happened during his meeting with his father and how his dearest dad had told him his music would kill people. He blamed himself for almost killing 𝐿 and started weeping pathetically. 𝐿 watched him in disgust and said he was disappointed in him and that it didn't matter if his music killed someone. Then 𝐿 remarked that Alan had already killed him once before on the day they met. That day he found Alan sitting out in the rain with nowhere to go, and so he took him in as a charity case because he thought Alan was like him, unloved and worthless. However, Alan proved him wrong when he started singing his wacky tunes, and that was the first time in a while that he felt good. Anne also shared how being with the two of them performing Phantom Lives had freed her from a half-dead state, so no matter what happened next, she was sure that they had her back. With that, they both grabbed Alan and gave him a corny speech about his music being their music. The speech worked because Alan could once again hear the imaginary music. He started weeping and apologizing, but they told him it was fine and agreed to cheer for Cozmez in their battle against 𝐒𝐒𝐿. Back on the stage, 𝐒𝐒𝐿 reminded 𝐾𝐈𝐍𝐿 to remember the day he found 𝐾𝐈𝐍𝐿 dying on the street. As the memories flooded into 𝐾𝐈𝐍𝐿's head, they said 𝐾𝐈𝐍𝐿 had acute metal corrosion. 𝐾𝐈𝐍𝐿 insisted that it had been a dream, and the next morning 𝐾𝐈𝐍𝐿 was beside him and always there. However, just then, 𝐾𝐈𝐍𝐿 disappeared from the stage, shocking everyone in the audience. While everyone else was confused, Ryu said that 𝐾𝐈𝐍𝐿 had been a ghost and 𝐒𝐔�𝐍𝐿 had known the truth. 𝐾𝐈𝐍𝐿 continued to have a breakdown on stage as the 𝐒𝐒𝐿 members told him that 𝐾𝐈𝐍𝐿 never existed and that he had always been an illusion. While they continued to back 𝐾𝐈𝐍𝐿 into a corner, Anne and the rest continued to watch what was happening on their phones because something was intercepting the signal. 𝐾𝐈𝐍𝐿 started experiencing metal corrosion, which was resonating with everyone's metal. The mad scientist cheered in his lab at the site and said the world would change. Meanwhile, the mystery silver-haired man rushed to the stage as his metal also started resonating with 𝐾𝐈𝐍𝐿. 𝐒𝐿 urged 𝐾𝐈𝐍𝐿 to become one with the metal, so no one would ever be alone again, and he'd be together with his brother. 𝐾𝐈𝐍𝐿 began to scream like a wild animal as the metal took over his body, while everyone else watched in terror except Ryu, who laughed maniacally. 𝐾𝐈𝐍𝐿's metal spiraled out of control as 𝐒𝐿 wrenched open his memory. Then 𝐒𝐿 dissolved into metal and consumed 𝐾𝐈𝐍𝐿, while urging him to use his moans to change the world. Just then, BAE arrived in their helicopter and saw a wrecked stadium. Still in his lab, the scientist revealed the site and gave his villain speech. While Alan, Anne and 𝐿 rushed to the stage, 𝐒𝐒𝐿 and the other boys tried helping 𝐾𝐈𝐍𝐿, but they were further infected with metal. The scientist kept monologuing his grand plan and revealed that they intended to create a collective consciousness through phantom metal and use the phantom lives to draw out the metal's potential. He intended to end wars, suffering and anger by melding everyone's minds together, just like Unity, Rick's psycho ex-girlfriend. However, the stranger, who turned out to be Shura, a member of 𝐒𝐿, stopped his ramblings. They started arguing, and like every other cliché villain, the scientist gloated that nobody could stop his plans. Meanwhile, BIE arrives at the stage to find 𝐾𝐈𝐍𝐿 and the others completely covered in metal. The mad scientist pointed and began shooting at Shura, but he was such a poor shot that Shura easily disarmed him and took away Yasha's metal. On stage, 𝐒𝐔𝐁𝐒𝐂𝐑𝐈𝐏𝐍𝐿 gave BAE a rundown of what had happened and how useless they had been. Soon enough, their metals also started resonating with 𝐾𝐈𝐍𝐿, but despite the pain he was in, Alan began speaking to 𝐾𝐈𝐍𝐿 and urged him to reclaim his music. Then the fool began singing, but surprisingly it was working as the metal slowly receded, and soon enough, the others joined in. Just then, Shura spoke to them through the sound system and told them to all continue singing. Without shame, each band sang a cringe-worthy song to 𝐾𝐈𝐍𝐿, and with each verse a piece of metal chipped away. But it wasn't until 𝐾𝐈𝐍𝐿's boyfriend 𝐒𝐔�𝐑𝐈𝐍𝐿 sang his heart out that Kanata began to remember how much his brother loved hip-hop. Everyone began to sing as one, which caused the metal to dissolve faster. Alan called out to Kanata and urged him to come back to them because he was no longer alone, creating a Firebird illusion that burned away all the surrounding metal. This finally freed Kanata from the metal grasp, and he woke up surrounded by the bands. As Club Paradox slowly disappeared, Shura took his leave of the scene. Later on, the police began investigating Alter Trigger for their involvement in the incident. Akanyatsura gathered at their favorite restaurant, Raimante, to eat and celebrate their survival, but Reo complained that they never met Buraikan. As they all said it dejectedly, 𝐒𝐒𝐓𝐈𝐍𝐿 laughed and revealed that Raimante's owner was actually Shura, and they all screamed in shock. The Cat Whisperers also celebrated the withdrawal of their eviction notice by Alter Trigger. Simon was glad that they were able to save their home, and he told Shiki that they would be able to stay there forever. As for BIE, Alan continued acting like a fool and bothering Hanju whenever he got inspiration for a new song. Kanata went to visit Nayuta's favorite spot, and as he stood there, an illusion of Nayuta with terrible hair appeared next to him.